A sharp clang echoed across the camp as the metal gates shut behind the delivery truck, its worn tires crunching over gravel. Karl Fischer looked up from the rough bench where he sat with his knees drawn close, his thin Red Cross-issued diary resting across his lap. The truck had arrived every morning since he'd been captured, but this time it wasn't meat or dark bread. Instead, the canvas-covered crates were filled with something that made the men murmur with confusion and contempt. A young American corporal, no older than 25, tossed down a box and shouted over the rattling noise of his companions. "More breakfast, gold boys, straight from Battle Creek, Michigan." The German prisoners crowded closer to the wire, eyes narrowing at the bold red lettering on the boxes, Kellogg's Cornflakes. The image of a cheerful rooster seemed to mock them in the morning haze. Karl stood slowly, his bones aching from the cold, and walked toward the edge of the group. "Corn?" Heinrich Bauer scoffed, arms crossed over his grease-stained uniform shirt. "Flakes of corn pressed flat, like hay for pigs," he said louder this time so everyone could hear. His voice carried the edge of bitterness wrapped in sarcasm. Laughter followed, thin, brittle laughter that didn't touch the eyes, but it didn't stop Karl's stomach from growling. He said nothing, only watched as a pair of guards began unloading crate after crate onto the mess tables, placing the unfamiliar boxes alongside cans of condensed milk and sacks of dried fruit. He could already sense what was coming. No bread today, no sausages, no boiled potatoes, just this foreign flake food that rustled like dried leaves inside its box. "Don't they know we're not their cattle?" muttered another prisoner beside him, whose name Karl didn't know. The man spit on the dirt in front of him, a gesture of protest that quickly dissolved into the morning dust. Karl returned to his bench and opened his diary. The paper had gone soft at the corners from the damp Pennsylvania air. He uncapped his pen with numb fingers and began to write, his strokes tense, uneven. "The war is lost," he scrawled, "but here in this camp, the Americans treat us with bread, blankets, and strange foods I do not trust." His gaze lifted from the page as a bowl was placed in front of him by a guard with a kind face but watchful eyes. Inside it, dry flakes clinked like dead leaves. No milk, no sugar, just the odd yellow food that smelled faintly sweet, like stale grain. Karl stared at it for a long moment, then pushed it away. Around him, others did the same. The entire camp mess hall became a quiet battlefield, not of fists or rifles, but of pride. Some prisoners laughed too loudly, mocking the meal. Others folded their arms and walked out without touching it. A few, very few, took cautious bites, only to grimace and toss the bowls aside. Across the hall, Sergeant William Harlan leaned against the doorframe, chewing the end of a matchstick and watching with amused detachment. A tall Midwesterner with a sunburned neck and permanent squint, he nodded at the scene and muttered to another guard, "They think it's pig feed." Let them. But the tension was simmering beneath the surface. By that afternoon, the unopened cereal boxes had become bartering tools, traded for crusts of old bread, for cigarettes, for anything familiar. Heinrich led the charge, mocking the cereal with one breath and using it as currency with the next. That evening, as Karl returned from latrine duty, he saw a small group huddled near the barracks. One of the younger boys, barely 18, was being berated by a senior NCO. "You ate it," the older man hissed, jabbing a finger at the boy's chest. "You ate the enemy's food like a dog begging at a table?" The boy looked down, ashamed but not apologetic. "It was not terrible," he mumbled. "Traitor," came the reply, spat like venom. The boy turned away and slipped back into the barracks without another word. Karl sat again on the bench, the box of cereal beside him unopened. The shadows of the camp stretched long across the dusty yard, barbed wire casting jagged patterns on the ground like scars. A cool wind blew through the rows of huts, lifting the smell of iron and straw. He opened the box, hesitated, then closed it again. Was this what surrender looked like? Not on the battlefield, but in small humiliations? In things as simple as breakfast? He opened his diary once more. To eat this is to surrender. But to starve with pride, what does that earn us? I wonder if this yellow food is a weapon in itself, meant to humiliate us until our pride breaks. From the command hut, a dim lamp flickered as night fell. Inside, the camp commandant, an aging American major with thinning hair, drafted a telegram with a furrowed brow. The paper bore the official Red Cross seal, but his tone was anything but diplomatic. Prisoners of war resistant to rations. Request supplemental bread to avoid disorder. Karl didn't know of the telegram, but he felt the unrest growing. It wasn't just hunger anymore. It was the slow erosion of certainty, of identity. He looked down at the flakes again. Light, fragile, innocent in appearance, but they carried weight. All around him, German soldiers walked with the careful dignity of men trying to remember who they used to be. Some still clung to discipline, others to denial, a few to bitterness. But every one of them at some point would have to choose between pride and survival. A loud clatter echoed through the mess hall as a box of cornflakes slid off the serving counter and spilled across the wooden floor, golden flakes scattering like confetti. The German prisoners stared at the mess, their expressions caught between disgust and disdain. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with soot-dark hands, muttered something in Bavarian dialect that made the others snicker. "Pig feed," someone else added loudly, and the laughter rose above the steady clink of tin cups and shuffling boots. Sergeant William Harlan, standing near the entrance with his arms folded across his chest, let out a soft chuckle. "They think it's pig feed. Let them," he said to Corporal Donnelly beside him, his voice low and amused, like a man watching children refuse their vegetables. Harlan's jaw moved slowly as he chewed gum, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room. He had seen many kinds of resistance in war, but this quiet rebellion over breakfast cereal, was new. Across the room, Karl Fischer picked at the corner of his metal tray, watching as the cornflakes were swept up by a weary mess hall attendant. The flakes had become a joke, a symbol of mockery passed between inmates like a sour secret. Men refused to eat them, pushing trays aside, swapping them for scraps of bread, or using them as bargaining chips for cigarettes. Some even crushed them underfoot in quiet protest. "Third box today," whispered Dieter, a younger prisoner seated beside Karl, his eyes darting nervously toward the guards. "They'll cut rations next." Karl didn't answer immediately. He opened the thin notebook hidden beneath his uniform jacket and scribbled a quick line with a dull pencil. "This yellow food is a weapon in itself, meant to humiliate us until our pride breaks." He stared at the words, unsure whether they were truth or bitterness pretending to be wisdom. Later that afternoon, Major Douglas Rains walked briskly along the outer fence of the camp, flipping through the latest inspection report. He stopped abruptly and read a line aloud. Nutritional intake falling below required minimum. Prisoners discarding cereal. Potential unrest if supplies not adjusted. He looked up and frowned. The American government had ordered the distribution of surplus cornflakes to reduce costs and clear stockpiles. Changing that order wasn't likely. He tapped the paper with his knuckle and sighed. "We'll monitor it." No point pushing them into rebellion over breakfast, but the rebellion had already begun, silent, slow-burning, and strangely symbolic. In Barrack 4B, Karl sat beside Heinrich Bauer, who was carefully folding a cigarette from shredded newspaper and dried leaves. The smell of old tobacco clung to Heinrich's coat, and his expression was sharp with thought. "You know what this really is?" Heinrich asked suddenly, nodding toward the corner where a few unopened cereal boxes sat stacked like bricks. "It's their myth. Every empire feeds its soldiers a story. Bread for the Romans, vodka for the Russians, and now cornflakes for the Americans." Karl raised an eyebrow. "A myth?" Heinrich leaned closer. "Yes, this is what they believe makes them strong, that even corn can be turned into gold." His voice was heavy with irony, but his eyes gleamed. "It's not just food. It's proof of their system, their simplicity, their science, their smugness." Karl frowned, unsure whether he agreed or was merely hungry enough to listen. He had not eaten all day, trading away his breakfast for half a crust of real bread that still smelled faintly of yeast. His stomach ached. Yet when he thought of dipping his spoon into that bright yellow mush, something inside him twisted with revulsion. The flakes weren't just food, they were a statement. To eat them felt like admitting defeat. That night, the tension in the camp shifted. Rain tapped against the tin roofs of the barracks, a soft patter that muffled conversation. In the dim mess hall, a handful of guards and prisoners gathered silently as the cook stirred a large vat of milk. Tonight's rations, they were told, would be nothing but cornflakes. No bread, no butter, no soup. A groan rippled through the line. Men muttered angrily. One tried to walk out only to be turned back by a silent guard with a rifle resting against his hip. Heinrich stood beside Karl in the queue, arms crossed tightly. "They're forcing this now," he hissed. "It's not food. It's surrender. Karl said nothing. His throat was dry, his body trembling slightly from hunger and fatigue. The line moved slowly. When it was finally his turn, he took the tray without a word. The flakes were soaked in warm milk, softening into something between porridge and paste. Steam curled upward. The smell was oddly sweet. He sat down at the edge of the room, spoon in hand, staring into the bowl. Around him, the men fidgeted, hesitating. One began to eat, slowly, then another. The sound of spoons tapping against metal trays filled the room. The crunch was unmistakable. Heinrich stayed frozen, his eyes locked on Karl. "Don't," he said. "Not like this." But Karl was too tired, too hollow. He lifted the spoon and brought it to his mouth. The first bite surprised him. It was sweet, not overpowering, but subtle, almost comforting. The texture was odd, but not unpleasant. He chewed slowly, his thoughts racing. The taste lingered on his tongue, and shame burned in his chest. He lowered the spoon and looked at Heinrich, but said nothing. Across the room, Sergeant Harlan watched from the doorway, one hand resting on his belt. He didn't smile. He just nodded once and stepped back into the rain. Karl reached for a second bite, then a third. All around him, the prisoners were eating in silence. There was no laughter now, just the low hum of surrender masked as survival. The sound of crunching filled the mess hall like the snapping of dry twigs. The crunch echoed like betrayal, and yet, to Karl's surprise, it tasted better than the mockery suggested. The shouting began near the mess hall, just after dawn roll call. A clatter of tin bowls, boots scraping gravel, and a loud crash of a wooden crate being kicked over split the morning calm. Karl Fischer stepped out of Barracks 3B and instinctively turned toward the noise. Two young prisoners, barely 18 by the look of them, scrambled to gather something spilled across the dirt. A third man, older and built like a blacksmith, loomed over them, red-faced and scowling. "Stealing from your own kind now?" the man bellowed in German. "You're selling our pride for sugar and milk." The younger one, Friedrich, held up both hands. "We didn't steal, Corporal Weber. We made a deal, fair trade. It's just cereal." Karl watched silently as Sergeant Otto Weber cursed under his breath and stormed off. Friedrich and his companion, Lucas, knelt to scoop up what had spilled, cornflakes soaked through and clinging together in soggy clumps. A small tin of condensed milk lay nearby, its top hastily peeled back with a spoon jammed inside. They had been caught in the act of selling bowls of sweetened cereal to fellow prisoners, what the guards had begun to call black market breakfast. By midday, rumors swirled through the camp. Some said Friedrich had made 3 packs of American cigarettes from one ration box. Others claimed Lucas had bartered his share for a broken wristwatch that still ticked. Karl leaned against the fence near the laundry shed, flipping through his diary, his pencil pausing mid-page as he listened to the speculation. They laughed at it. "Now they'd trade boots for a bowl," murmured Private Emil Kessler beside him, chuckling dryly. "They laughed because they didn't know better," Karl replied. "Now they do." He didn't say it aloud, but Karl had been among the first to try the cornflakes when hunger overtook pride. He remembered the sound of the first crunch in his mouth, crisp, sweet, surprising. That morning, he'd added a few droplets of milk and eaten them slowly, savoring the strange but comforting taste. He hadn't laughed. He had stared into his bowl, wondering how something so simple could pierce so deeply into the walls he had built around himself. Later that evening, the guards conducted an impromptu inspection. Sergeant William Harlan led the sweep, flanked by 2 younger MPs. They knocked over crates, flipped bedrolls, and emptied storage bins. Inside Barracks 5A, they found what they were looking for, a hidden stash of cornflakes wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath a loose floorboard. "Looks like breakfast's more popular than we thought," Harlan remarked dryly, scribbling in his notepad. "Raines will want this in his report." Indeed, the next day, Major Douglas Raines included the following in his typed inspection notes. "Prisoners adapting to rations with unexpected enthusiasm. Cereal, now a source of barter economy. Guard oversight required to prevent exploitation." The irony of it all wasn't lost on Karl. Just a few weeks earlier, the flakes had been the target of every joke in the camp. Heinrich Bauer, the grim-faced mechanic from Dresden, had led the mockery with theatrical performances at mealtimes, pretending to feed invisible pigs or flicking the flakes into the mud with a spoon. But now, even he had gone quiet. That night, Karl found Heinrich sitting alone near the rec-yard fence, arms crossed, eyes locked on the fading orange sky. A single, untouched cereal box sat beside him. You still haven't eaten any? Karl asked, lowering himself onto the bench. Heinrich didn't look at him. I've eaten worse. It's not about the food, Karl waited, letting the silence stretch. We are becoming like them, Heinrich said finally, his voice low and tight. First their cereal. Then what? Their language? Their ideas? Karl shook his head. It's just survival, Heinrich. No, Heinrich snapped, turning to face him now. It's surrender. They don't even need guns. They feed us flakes and watch us trade our dignity for sugar. Karl leaned forward, elbows on knees. Maybe survival isn't shame. Maybe it's learning when to bend instead of break. Heinrich's eyes narrowed. You sound like them already. That night, Karl wrote in his diary by candle stub. His handwriting was slower now, more careful, as if the weight of each word mattered more. If we can learn from even this, he wrote, maybe survival is not shame. The camp was quieter now during meals. No more loud laughter, no more staged mockeries. The crunch of cornflakes had become familiar, almost ritual. But beneath the calm, the divide deepened. The older soldiers, raised in the discipline of the Reich, resented the adaptation. The younger ones, hungry for more than food, were changing in ways they didn't yet understand. The flakes had stopped being just food. They had become something else, something symbolic, something dangerous. The next morning, Karl watched Friedrich hand over a small folded note in exchange for a bowl of soaked cereal. Not money, not rations, a poem, handwritten in charcoal, about home and bread and rivers. Something had shifted. A new kind of value was being traded. And in that moment, Karl felt it clearly. Foreshadowing whispered through the camp. Cornflakes, once a joke, would soon become the center of a deeper revelation. The wooden boards were dragged into the courtyard before breakfast, slamming against the gravel with a dull thud. A few prisoners, still groggy from a restless night, turned to look. A hush fell across the morning routine as the American guards began hammering charts to the makeshift stands, bright, clean posters that looked absurdly out of place among the rusted fences and soiled uniforms. At first, the German prisoners assumed it was another inspection or morale ploy, but then a man in a white coat stepped forward, flanked by Red Cross officers. He wore thick glasses, held a clipboard, and began speaking in clear, slow English. Another man, an interpreter named Corporal Beck, translated. Today, Beck announced, you will learn why American children grow tall, strong, and healthy. A murmur of derision rippled through the rows of POWs. Someone coughed. Someone else laughed under his breath. Karl Fischer stood near the back, arms crossed, chin tilted slightly. He watched the scene with quiet tension. Heinrich Bauer stood beside him, scoffing loudly. This is a circus, Heinrich muttered. Next, they'll feed us candy and call it a weapon. Shh, Karl said, barely above a whisper, but his eyes stayed fixed on the speaker. The American dietitian continued, pointing to the chart behind him. It was simple but jarring, figures of children with robust limbs and bright smiles, paired with bar graphs showing reduced disease rates over the past decade. This, Beck translated, is the result of consistent nutrition. Vitamin-enriched cereal, cornflakes, every morning. Not just food, but strategy. He tapped the side of a box now resting on the table beside him. It was the same familiar yellow package that had become the object of ridicule and bartering in the mess hall. Karl's stomach tightened. The irony burned. This is propaganda, Heinrich said, louder this time. Look at them. Showing off their breakfast like it won the war. But Karl remained silent. Something gnawed at him. Not hunger this time, but discomfort of a different sort. He recalled the first time he'd seen the cereal. Flat yellow shards, dry and brittle. He remembered how they had laughed, calling it yellow paper and pretending to eat it like livestock. And yet, he had eaten it. He remembered the taste. He remembered the strange sweetness and the clean crunch. It hadn't tasted like defeat. The interpreter handed out copies of a printed sheet, an educational pamphlet. Karl took one, surprised by the thick paper and clean ink. The title read in bold, black letters, Cereal as Cornerstone of Modern Nutrition. Beneath it, a paragraph outlined the idea that daily fortified cereal had drastically improved children's health in American cities. Photos showed poor neighborhoods, then smiling schoolboys, lined up with spoons in hand. As Karl read, a strange thought hit him. This was more than breakfast. It was an infrastructure, a system, a design. He looked up. The dietitian had moved on to discussing disease prevention, and how cereal fortified with niacin, iron, and thiamine had contributed to reducing anemia and rickets. Each serving, he said through Beck, delivers essential vitamins to build a stronger nation. The words slammed into Karl like a quiet accusation. Heinrich tore the pamphlet in half. "They think we're fools," he spat, "selling us lies with colored ink." Karl said nothing. He folded the paper and slid it into his shirt. That night the barracks buzzed with opinions. "They want us to envy them," one man said bitterly. "They want to show us how weak we are." "They're not wrong," another replied less confidently. "Have you seen how thin we've gotten?" Karl sat at the end of his bunk, staring at the pamphlet in his lap. A lantern swung slightly above, casting long shadows across the floor. His mind raced, not just with hunger or shame, but with realization. They hadn't won with just weapons. They had built a nation on preparation, on health, on logistics. Heinrich stormed past, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He pointed at Karl's folded paper. "Don't let that trash into your head, Fischer," he snapped. "You think vitamins beat tanks?" Karl didn't rise to the bait. He stared at the shadows instead. "No," he said quietly, "but maybe tanks aren't enough." The silence that followed was heavy. A few nearby men turned to look. Heinrich, caught off guard, said nothing. The two men stared at each other for a beat, then Heinrich walked away, muttering curses under his breath. Outside, the wind pushed against the tin roof. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The air was cold, but Karl stayed seated, holding the paper like it was something fragile and important. The next morning, the cornflakes were served again. No one laughed. No one traded. They ate in silence. And as Karl lifted the spoon to his lips, he didn't taste surrender anymore. He tasted something else: stability, strategy, a quiet kind of strength. In his diary that night, he wrote just one line. What began as mockery of pig feed became a window into why they had lost the war. Heinrich was caught with a box of cornflakes clutched to his chest like contraband. It was just after roll call, a gray morning thick with spring mist, when the guards spotted him slipping through the back door of the commissary storage shed. Private Lenny Jacobson raised his voice immediately. Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Heinrich froze. For a moment he seemed to shrink in size, as if the weight of what he held, what it symbolized, was heavier than the box itself. His boots sank slightly into the muddy patch of ground outside the shed, his breath visible in the cold air. Slowly, without a word, he handed over the stolen ration. Sergeant Harlan approached, flanked by two other guards. "Cornflakes, huh?" he said, lifting the box and examining it like it was an artifact. "Didn't you call this yellow paper for pigs a few weeks ago?" His voice wasn't cruel, but the sarcasm didn't go unnoticed. The other guards chuckled. Heinrich stood stiff, eyes forward, a faint redness blooming across his cheeks. They didn't beat him. They didn't even yell. Harlan just shook his head, signed something on a clipboard, and ordered the guards to escort Heinrich back to Barrack 4. "Let him stew on it," he muttered. "Even the proudest must eat." Word of the incident spread through the camp like frost creeping across window panes. The men didn't laugh. They didn't mock him. If anything, they looked at Heinrich with a new kind of understanding. The barrier between mockery and acceptance had been broken, not with defiance, but with quiet hunger. Karl watched the fallout with narrowed eyes from his bunk near the window. The light filtered in weakly, casting soft shadows on the wooden floor and the threadbare blankets. He picked up his diary and wrote slowly, carefully, as if the act of recording the moment required reverence. "We laughed at their flakes, but it was we who were brittle, breaking with every bite." He set the pen down and looked around. Breakfast was being served, and for the first time since his capture there was no reluctance in the mess hall. The line moved smoothly. The clink of tin bowls and the crunch of flakes under spoon filled the room. No one spoke. There were no jokes about pig food or yellow cardboard, just the sound of men eating. Across the table, Josef Reiner, a young radio operator barely 19, dipped his spoon again and again into the bowl, his lips moving silently as he counted each bite. Karl leaned closer. "Are you praying?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Joseph looked up, startled, then shook his head. "No. Counting. I only get 7 spoonfuls if I don't stretch the milk. 9. If I do," Karl didn't know how to respond. He glanced down at his own bowl. The milk was thin, the flakes already turning soggy, yet something about the ritual comforted him. Not the food itself, but the structure, the routine, the order, the sense of beginning and end. He remembered a phrase from the American dietitian's talk weeks earlier. A nation that feeds its children well builds strength before it even starts a war. At the time, it sounded like arrogance. Now, Karl saw it differently, not as a threat, but a revelation. Later that day, he passed Heinrich in the barracks corridor. The older man sat on his bunk, head bowed, hands resting on his knees. His face was unreadable, somewhere between shame and exhaustion. "You all right?" Karl asked, pausing. Heinrich looked up slowly, eyes meeting Karl's. "I thought I could hold out longer," he whispered, "but I woke up dreaming of it." Sweetness, crispness, something simple, something good. Karl didn't answer. He didn't have to. That night the camp fell quiet early. The April wind pushed softly against the wooden walls. From outside came the distant hum of trucks, possibly bringing more rations, more boxes stacked in the back like gold bars of an unfamiliar empire. Karl sat at his bunk, diary open once again, fingers tracing the edge of a torn page. In the corner of the room, a few men passed around a small tin can of condensed milk. One of them laughed, a soft sound, almost embarrassed. It faded quickly. The next morning, the silence at breakfast was the same. No one spoke as they ate. There were no protests, no jokes, just the quiet chewing of survival. It was as if the flakes had stopped being food and started being something else, symbols of order, of efficiency, of a world that hadn't collapsed. In the command office, Major Rains filed his final report. Prisoners now consuming cereal willingly. Resistance transformed into acceptance. Food as silent teacher of adaptation. Outside, Karl walked the perimeter of the camp. The fences were still there, the towers still manned, but inside, something had changed. Not just among the men, but within himself. The flakes weren't just breakfast. They were the quiet proof that victory didn't always shout. Sometimes it came in the form of sweetened grains and warm milk. He picked up his spoon and dipped it into the bowl with steady hands. Across from him, Heinrich did the same. No one laughed. The flakes had turned into symbols of survival, and survival demanded humility. Karl Fischer stopped dead in his tracks, the corner of a rusted cargo truck biting into his shoulder as he stared at the open crates stacked across the reconstruction office warehouse floor. The gray morning light filtering through broken window panes gave everything a washed-out hue, but the bright red lettering on the side of one box stood out like a wound. Kellogg's Cornflakes. His breath caught. A younger worker passed behind him, pushing a dolly stacked with powdered milk tins. "You all right, Herr Fischer?" he asked casually, not slowing down. Karl didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the cardboard boxes. He stepped forward slowly, one hand trembling slightly as he reached into the crate. His fingers brushed the waxy surface of a sealed cereal bag, light as air, unmistakable. He pulled it free and turned it over in his hand like it might vanish if he blinked. Then, from behind, came the sound of a boy's laughter. "Look, Papa! It's like snow!" Karl turned. A rail-thin child with blonde hair and dirt-smeared cheeks was crouched beside another crate, holding a handful of cornflakes aloft like treasure. His father, a coal-smudged man in patched trousers, chuckled as he handed the boy a dented tin of condensed milk. Karl watched as the father tore the box open further and poured flakes into a chipped bowl. The boy didn't wait. He scooped up a handful and stuffed it into his mouth, crunching noisily, grinning through the crumbs. It was like watching history in reverse. Karl could still hear Heinrich's voice in his memory. Flakes for pigs. He could still smell the dust of the barracks, still feel the gnawing hunger masked with bitter pride, but here there was no laughter, no mockery, just hunger and quiet joy. He clutched the cereal box tighter and stepped away, his boots echoing across the hollow floor. He walked past rusted shelves, old maps of bombed districts. A shattered clock stopped at 2:17. The diary was in his coat pocket, now frayed and sun-stained. He had carried it through the war's ashes, through trains and ruined cities, through nights of rebuilding that never seemed to end. He hadn't opened it in months. Now, sitting on a broken crate behind the warehouse, he took it out. The pages fluttered in the breeze, entries in stiff, spiky German. Yellow paper food, weapon disguised as breakfast. We laughed to survive. His hand hovered over a blank page. Then he uncapped a fountain pen and wrote slowly. He was still writing when footsteps approached. It was Captain Ulrich Mertens, one of the new American liaisons. Young, clean-shaven, with the unfazed confidence of someone who hadn't lived through rubble. He carried a clipboard. "You've seen the care shipment?" Mertens asked, nodding at the crates. Karl nodded silently. "We'll need help distributing them to the family centers before noon." Karl's pen paused. "They will be grateful," he said, then looked down at the open page. "Most of them." Mertens peered over. "You were a prisoner, weren't you?" he asked, not with judgment but curiosity. Karl didn't answer at first. He tapped the page with the end of his pen. "In Pennsylvania," he said finally. "A camp surrounded by trees. They fed us cornflakes." Mertens chuckled. No wonder this shipment hit a nerve. But Karl wasn't laughing. "We thought it was meant to shame us," he said. "But it was something else. It was quiet power. You fed us what your children ate." Mertens blinked, unsure what to say. Karl looked at the crates again, watching as another boy tugged at a box, grinning. "Now, our children eat it too." There was a pause. Then Karl said softly, "It is strange, isn't it? That the things we mocked once now help us rebuild." Mertens gave a small, respectful nod and walked away, clipboard in hand. Karl remained still for a long time. Around him, men unloaded boxes and children's voices echoed off concrete. One boy shouted in delight over a tin of peaches. Another tried to sneak a second box of cereal. Laughter rang out, not mocking, but real, honest joy. He turned back to his diary and penned the last lines with careful thought. His handwriting had steadied. "We mocked their flakes as weakness. But it was strength, quiet, enduring, disguised as simplicity. Perhaps the war was not lost in guns, but in the kitchens where nations fed their sons." Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It plays on themes of cultural pride, irony, and unexpected shifts in perspective during times of conflict. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke thought, and inspire reflection on how even small, ordinary things can bridge divides and challenge assumptions.